given by Professor Salim Mishtawi from Benghazi, Libya, and he's going to talk about Stelara or Ustekinumab, the innovation in ulcerative colitis. So I hope Professor Salim is there.
Hello there. Do you hear me?
Yes, now I hear you, Professor Salim. Hello.
Okay, hi. I'll start sharing. Hang on a second. Okay, so do you see the slides now?
Yes, I think we can see.
Yep. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and congratulations for launching the Association for Colitis and Crohn's Disease. What I'm going to do today is to talk about Stelara, which is innovation in ulcerative colitis treatment. Now, as you know, the aim of new innovations or new medications is to get lasting remission in inflammatory bowel disease, a target that we have been trying to achieve for a long time. Now, during this talk, we're going to go briefly through Stelara heritage and talk a little bit on use of Stelara in Crohn's disease. And then we'll put more focus and more emphasis on Stelara in ulcerative colitis, mainly the UNIFY trial. So, as you know, over the last 10 years, Stelara has been used for inflammatory mediated or immune mediated inflammatory diseases, starting from plaque psoriasis through Crohn's disease, and finally in 2019 it was approved for ulcerative colitis. I'm sure you know this very well, but the updated American College of Gastroenterology guidelines and ECO guidelines, both of them recommended the use of ustekinumab in patients with moderate to severe active luminal Crohn's disease, either in bio-naive patients or who didn't respond to conventional therapy or to anti-TNF-alpha therapy failures. Stelara is the first and the only IL-23, IL-12 inhibitor that's now approved for the treatment of moderate to severely active Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis patients. If we look now the rapid response of in Crohn's disease, in Unity 1 and Unity 2 trials, we can see that clinical response was achieved as early as 6 weeks of treatment with Stelara, with 56% of patients who are TNF-alpha blocker naive and 34% of patients who are TNF-alpha blocker failures. So that's a pretty quick response within 6 weeks. Patients continued to maintain that remission during the follow-up period for 3 years, and of those who achieved remission during induction, around 70% of patients maintained their induction response or maintained their remission. If you look at the patients who were conventional therapy failures, i.e. no TNF-alpha failure, around 74% of these patients maintain their remission over the 3 years of study. So in general, in Crohn's disease, clinical response is achieved in 56 patients of 56% of patients who are predominantly TNF-alpha blocker naive. The response was rapid in 51% of patients who are TNF-alpha blocker naive patients. In Unity 2 trial, they showed a 70-point response as early as week 3. Clinical remission was also very significant. 53% of patients were in clinical remission at 52 weeks after induction dose. at a year, which is good. 3 years open label long-term extension, 74% of patients maintained their remission. And the safety profile was comparable with other indications of Stelara. Now we come to ulcerative colitis, and this is the unified trial, and this is the overall study design. So it's split into 3 divisions: the introduction, the induction, the maintenance, and the late term extension. In the induction, patients were randomized at week 0 into a placebo or ustekinumab, either 130 milligram IV standard dose, or weight range-based ustekinumab 6 milligram per kilogram. They were assessed at week 6. So those who responded to placebo at week, they were assessed at week 8, and those who were responders to placebo at week 8, they continued on to placebo. The responders from the ustekinumab groups were randomized into either placebo subcutaneously or into ustekinumab 90 milligram every 8 weeks or every 12 weeks. The non-responders from the placebo group were given ustekinumab weight range-based bolus, and they were assessed 8 weeks later. If they respond, they will be randomized with the rest of patients. If they are not responders, then they will stop or discontinued from Stelara, and they will have 20 weeks safety follow-up. Now, from the Stelara 2 groups, there was subset of patients who were late responders, and they responded at week 16. And these were randomized as well into placebo or into subcutaneous Stelara, either every 8 weeks or every 12 weeks. Now, the primary and secondary endpoints of these studies were clinical remission was the primary endpoint, and there were 2 definitions that was used in this study. The global definition, which is more strict, which means Mayo score less than or equal to, with no individual subscore more than 1. And the US definition, which is absolute stool number less than or equal 3, rectal bleeding subscore of 0, and Mayo endoscopy score 0 or 1. The secondary endpoints at week 8 included clinical response, endoscopic healing, histologic healing, mucosal healing, and quality of life, depending on the baseline IBD questionnaire, quality of life questionnaire. Now, the characteristic of patients at baseline were not too different between the different study groups. Specifically, if you look at the biologic failure status, the percentage of patients with biologic failure status were comparable between different groups of study. Again, if you look at the medications used, corticosteroid use, more or less similar within the whole groups. The non-biologic medication history, again, similar. The 5-MB or azathioprine, the corticosteroids are similar. Biological or previous biologic history, almost 50% of patients had previous exposure to TNF-alpha. Other medications are well reported comparable in all groups. Now we come to the primary endpoint, which is clinical remission at week 8. And using the global definition, we have significant increase in clinical remission in both the single dose 130 milligram and the weight based range Stelara compared to the placebo. Using the US definition, it's the same, much more clinical remission in the Stelara group compared to placebo group. Now, clinical remission using the global definition, most studies use the local reading, but in this study, both local and central reading means that all data were read in a single place. So both methods were adopted, and there was no much difference or no impact of central reading on the results. Still significant increase in clinical remission in the Stelara arm compared to the placebo arm. Now, if we split patients into biologic failure and no biologic failure, again, we can see that in the non-biologic failure group, patients showed significant increase in clinical remission. Again, in the biologic failure group, there is a lot of difference if you look at the placebo here, because these are the sort of difficult patients, if you want to call them. Only 1.2% of the placebo group achieved remission, whereas it's about tenfold in the Stelara arm. If we use the US definition, clinical remission again in biologic and non-biologic groups, same results. The Stelara has got much more significant remission rate compared to placebo. Now, Stelara is the first and only approved ulcerative colitis treatment to achieve histoendoscopic mucosal improvement, which means endoscopic improvement plus histologic improvement. If we come to endoscopic healing, by 8 weeks, the biologic failure and the non-biologic failure, both of them showed much more endoscopic healing compared to placebo. For the histological healing, again, very significant p-value, more significant histologic healing seen in ustekinumab groups. And we care about histologic healing because it's linked to improved clinical outcomes, less hospitalization, and probably reduced risk of cancer development as well. So if we combine histoendoscopic healing together at week 8, in this graph, we can see that we achieved histoendoscopic healing in more patients on Stelara compared with patients who received placebo. The clinical response now, which is a secondary endpoint, if you look at the biologic failure and no biologic failure patients, both of them, we achieved significant increase in clinical response compared to placebo group. So if we look at this graph here, Stelara induced a rapid and high efficacy through week 16 and week 8 as well. So at week 8, about 67% of non-biologic failure patients and about 62% of all randomized patients achieved clinical response with just a single dose of Stelara 6 milligram per kilogram. If we combine week 8 to the late responders at week 16, then we have 87% of non-biologic failure and almost 80% of all patients achieving clinical response by just following the induction regime. Now, this graph here shows the effect on fecal calprotectin concentration, and we all know that this is one of the biomarkers that we used for disease activity. Now, starting from week 2, fecal calprotectin started to decrease and it continued to decrease further up to week 8. So in summary, for the primary endpoints, we achieved clinical remission in a significant percentage of patients. And for the secondary endpoints, we achieved endoscopic healing, clinical response, mucosal healing, and histologic improvement. So the summary of the induction is that in patients moderately to severe ulcerative colitis, ustekinumab administered as a single dose, either 130 milligram or 6 milligram per kg bolus, resulted in induced clinical remission, endoscopic healing, improved health-related quality of life, induced mucosal healing, and also reduction in CRP, fecal calprotectin, and other markers. Now we come to the safety figures through week 8. And from this table here, we see that there was no much difference between the groups. Now, there's one death in the 6 milligram per kilogram Stelara induction, and this death was attributed to upper GI bleeding due to esophageal varices. No much serious adverse events, and the infections were comparable among all groups. Serious infections were actually more in the placebo group compared to the Stelara groups. The adverse events within 1 hour of infusion were similar, and the malignancy, there was no malignancy recording during this induction. Now, the treatment emergent adverse events were also recorded, and they were comparable between all groups. So in summary, single intravenously administered Stelara is well tolerated through week 8, and no dose-related safety events. Treatment emergent adverse events are similar across treatment groups. Serious adverse event, we mentioned that there's one patient who died of bleeding from esophageal varices. Infections, no serious infections or tuberculosis, and there was no delayed hypersensitivity or anaphylaxis. Now, we come to the maintenance part of the study, where patients were given either placebo or subcutaneous Stelara, either 90 milligram every 8 weeks or every 12 weeks, and followed through 44 weeks. Now, we look at the ulcerative colitis disease characteristic at maintenance baseline, which didn't show much difference between all groups. Specifically, if we look at endoscopic healing, it was similar at baseline between all groups. And the patients who had failure to biologics were similar between the 3 groups. Now, clinical remission at week 44 for overall population showed that ustekinumab weight-based, 90 milligrams subcutaneously, given every 8 weeks, is superior to placebo and superior to patients who received ustekinumab every 12 weeks. Now, the placebo group here are the patients who received induction with ustekinumab at week 0, and they responded. After that, during maintenance, they were enrolled or randomized into placebo, so they received placebo. Significant clinical remission. Now, if we look at the impact of biological failure status on the treatment using the global definition, the groups are divided into no biofailures, which is 94% of patients are bio-naive, but there are 6% of patients who were exposed to biologicals, but they stopped biologicals and they didn't continue them. So that's why it's called no biofailure. Then we have the bio-naive group and the bio-failure group. Other groups included VIDO. Now, significant improvement in clinical remission in no biofailure in the bio-naive and in the biofailure group as well. And similar to previous slides, patients who received ustekinumab every 8 weeks got better results than who received it every 12 weeks. Now, the clinical remission among remitters at maintenance baseline, so those who achieved remission, around 65% of patients using the global definition maintained their remission. And using the United States or US definition, around 61% of patients maintained their remission through week 44. For overall population, around 68% of patients on ustekinumab every 12 weeks, around 71% of patients on ustekinumab 90 milligrams subcutaneously every 8 weeks maintained remission or clinical response through week 44. If we come to endoscopic healing at week 44, the 8 weeks group, a little bit more than half of patients maintained endoscopic or showed endoscopic healing. Histologic healing as well, almost 60% now, 59.3% of patients showed histologic healing at 44 weeks, sorry. Mucosal healing, so to combine both, 45.9% of patients demonstrated mucosal healing at week 44. Now we come to the steroid-free remission, and this is really our concern, not to keep patients on steroids for a long time. We find that using the global definition of remission, around 42% of patients were steroid-free at week 44, and 41% of patients were free using the US definition. The fecal calprotectin, as we said, following induction, it decreased, and then it continued to decrease up to week 44. On the other hand, the placebo group who were given Stelara in the beginning and responded, it decreased, but once they were randomized into placebo, it went up again. Now, the median IBD quality of life questionnaire score showed also improvement of quality of life in Stelara groups compared to placebo group. Sorry. So in summary, a subject with moderate to severe ulcerative colitis who responded to a single dose of induction and received ustekinumab every 8 weeks or 12 weeks, achieved clinical remission and endoscopic improvement at week 44, maintained clinical response through week 44, and achieved corticosteroid-free clinical remission. They also maintained clinical remission through week 44 among the patients who were late responders, and there was also improvement in quality of life and decrease in biomarkers. So the delayed responders, patients who responded at week 16, now the outcomes in these are more or less comparable with the early responders. Now, about 60% of these patients responded to or maintained their remission, clinical remission, clinical endoscopic, healing, histologic improvement, more or less similar to the early ones. So the delayed responders, again, clinical response in 62%, through week 44, clinical remission, endoscopic improvement, and histological, and corticosteroid-free remission in 27.4% of patients. The safety profile of Stelara is also good. Now, during maintenance, I mean. Now, the death here, there was only one death, which was due to acute respiratory failure in someone who had surgery. Serious adverse events were comparable among all groups. There were two malignancies, excluding non-melanoma skin cancer. And the treatment emergent adverse events were comparable as well. So the subcutaneous administration of 90 milligram every 8 weeks or every 12 weeks, well tolerated. Treatment emergent adverse events were similar. Serious adverse events were not commonly reported. One death, this patient had respiratory failure after who was a delayed responder to ustekinumab. Infections, one patient had tuberculosis, but that patient actually left the study and he went back into infliximab. 3 opportunistic infections, 2 cytomegalovirus colitis, and 1 subject with concurrent ophthalmic and oral herpes simplex. Subjects with adverse events leading to discontinuation of study were higher in the placebo group compared with the Stelara group. Now, there were 6 malignancies reported, 3 non-melanoma skin cancers, 2 of them squamous cell carcinoma, and 1 basal cell carcinoma, 3 solid organ tumors, 1 renal cell carcinoma, 1 colon cancer, and 1 testicular cancer. No anaphylaxis or delayed type hypersensitivity, and there were 2 subjects who had major acute cardiovascular events. This one of them due to had thyroidectomy complicated by prolonged hypoxemia. Now, so summary of safety. Less than 1% hypersensitivity reaction, less than 1% malignancy rate, less than 2% serious infections, and less than 5% of patients developed antibodies. And most of these antibodies are neutralizing antibodies, which may not influence the effect of the medication. Now, the immunogenicity through week 44 of the 680 subjects in the Stelara group, the antibodies incidence was 30.4% among the randomized Stelara groups versus 9.1 among the placebo group. So overall, in subjects with moderate to severe ulcerative colitis, ustekinumab administered either 90 milligrams subcutaneously every 12 weeks or every 8 weeks during maintenance achieves endoscopic healing and clinical remission, maintains clinical response, spares corticosteroid use, provides sustained benefit in quality of life and biomarkers, and both regimes were well tolerated. So if we look at the dosing, it's very convenient. So during induction, we use either 2 or 3 or 4 vials, depending on the weight of the patient. And if you are going into every 12-week maintenance, you will need only 4 injections per year. If we compare that to other biologicals, you need much less vials during the year. So to conclude, Stelara has 10 years of heritage. Its efficacy from a single IV dose and high percentage of response. It has lasting efficacy with a minimal corticosteroid use, consistent safety profile, and convenient dosing. Thank you very much for listening.